Hello, everyone. Good afternoon to our East Coast attendees and good morning to our West Coast attendees. My name is Hunter Wack, Business Development Manager at RAECO Rents. Thank you all for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us for this webinar. Our presenters today are Alex Watts and Bevan Meade with ALS Environmental. They are going to give us an in-depth look at how to work with a lab and provide the correct information for your sampling and analysis to go smoothly. Some topics they will cover today include how to sample using cassettes, PPIs, and sorbent tubes, services and resources from ALS, key practices to follow during sampling, orientation, and labeling, silica-focused guidance and updated industry standards. Alex and Bevan are both project managers focusing on high-quality customer service and ensuring sampling and analysis go smoothly for their clients. Alex and Bevan have been a great resource for RAECO Rents, providing technical insight to all of ALS's products and sampling abilities. Whether it was at a conference or an AIHA event, it's always nice to have a friendly, reliable face that understands the equipment, OSHA, and NIOSH sampling needs and analytical procedures at a deep level such as Alex and Bevan. Since we do have a large number of attendees, everyone will be muted. We do have a chat box that you can use to ask any questions or leave comments. We will try to answer all questions at the end of the presentation if we have enough time. About 1 or 2 hours after the webinar, you'll receive a certificate of attendance along with a recording of the webinar. If you don't receive this, feel free to send us an email and we'll send that to you. The webinar will also be posted on our website for you to view at any time. At this time, I'm going to turn the mic over to Alex and let him take the lead. Welcome, Alex.
All right, thanks, Hunter. Really appreciate it. We're super excited to be here with you today, and there's a lot of different things that we can go through. So we'll go ahead and get started. So this is sampling essentials, cassettes, compliance, and sampling techniques. Some of the objectives that we would like to cover today are to clarify the roles of labs versus rental companies, who supplies what type of analysis you should be looking for, or essentially what you need to do with that. And next is ensuring proper coordination with the lab. Then we'll go into basic sampling setup and practices, client and lab communication and interpreting results. And then also we'll go through a lot of common pitfalls and new regulations. So first we'll start off with clarifying roles of labs versus rental companies. So when do you need to use one versus the other? Rental companies like RAECO Rents, so these are really good for real-time monitoring equipment. So if you need something that can monitor right in the moment and you can see what the concentration is right then, there are a lot of great instruments for that. So this would be something like noise dosimeters and sound level meters. That's exactly what they do. So those would be perfect for that. Direct read gas monitors. So that would be, something like a PID or photoionization detector. Those work great for things like this. Particle counters and dust monitors. So if you're looking for something like ceiling limits and things, this also would be great for that with particle counters and dust monitors, and then also heat stress monitors. When you would need an analytical lab is for sample analysis. So if you're looking at something like doing air sampling, wipe sampling, bulk sampling from filters and media, this is when you'd want to use a lab. TWA exposure assessments, though these can be done as well there are some instruments that will do TWAs for you and calculate, over your full 8 hours. A lot of times that is typically done through a lab where you'll sample for 8 hours to be able to get your TWA exposures. As far as complex analyses, this is another thing. So once you start getting into metals, there are a lot of other VOCs that can be covered with the lab than maybe what you could potentially do with a direct read. And then also something like pesticides. There's a lot of other things that a lab can do that there are a lot of monitors that wouldn't be able to do the same thing for you there. And then specialized testing protocols. So kind of along those same lines there. All right, so what is to look for within a lab? There are some essential qualifications that you're going to want to, when you're looking around for a lab, you're going to want to make sure that they have these few qualifications to be able to perform your specific analyses. So you're always going to want to confirm any type of accreditation. And one big one is the AIHA or ISO 17025 accreditation. And one of the things that a couple of things that you get with that is it'll demonstrate technical competence, traceability and measurement confidence, and quality management systems to be able to ensure that your samples are being taken care of there. Project-specific regulatory certifications. So this is also, there are some government contracts, other companies require certain certifications as well. So always make sure that you're communicating with the lab as far to make sure that they have the specifications that a certain project is looking for. Analysis methods for key contaminants. So we run into this sometimes where we'll have industrial hygienists or others, they look online and they'll find a method that will work for a certain analyte, and then, or a certain compound, and then they sample for it, they'll send it in, and it's not something that we'll be able to analyze by that specific method. So always make sure you're communicating with the lab to make sure that whatever method you are using is something that coincides with what the lab has there. Awareness of laboratory support limits. So there's a lot of things that go along with this, whether it be turnaround time, reporting limits, pricing. There are some panel options available, so we cannot support screens for unknowns. We're not like a crime show where we can solve the mystery by the next commercial break, right? Like this is something that sometimes it takes a lot more time, and so just make sure that you put that in within your project scope as well. Couple of things too to note, that there are some capabilities for odor investigation, but it can be a shot in the dark without context. So always try to provide context when you can for the lab. It helps out a ton to be able to help dial down exactly what it is you have. I can't tell you how many times that we get people calling in and they don't know what to sample for, even if it's starting with SDSs, right? Like that's typically where we would start. You want to dial it down just to make sure that you have something to go off of. And the human nose is actually a great detector, but it is subjective, right? So a nose can detect down to around 30 parts per billion for hydrogen sulfide, but sometimes we might not be able to go as low as what a nose can detect. So just keep that in mind as well, especially for like indoor air quality assessments, things like that. And then just make sure you contact a project manager for site lab coordination for all of that. It really makes things so much smoother if you contact us before actually getting started to be able to make sure that we're both on the same page there. All right, so now we're going to go into ensuring proper coordination with the lab, which I'll turn the time over to Bevan.
Thanks, Alex. A handful of things that you'll want to know before starting your project, before planning your sampling objectives. You'll want to reach out to the lab and just confirm a few things. The primary thing you want to look for is identifying your hazards. Alex touched on this a little bit already, but a good place to start is SDS sheets. You can look at site-specific processes to try to identify specific target compounds that you want to look at. And if it's kind of an unknown situation, talking to employees that may be showing specific symptoms or just noticing things that are out of the ordinary can often help point you in the right direction. From there, you'll want to be able to identify available methods that will support analysis and sampling for those target compounds. Some good resources for that are the CDC and OSHA websites and the NIOSH Pocket Guide. What you can do is search for specific compounds and it'll show you a lot of good information like exposure limits, analytical methods, even some sampling parameters. And so you can do a little bit of research ahead of time before reaching out to the lab to see what might work best for your specific situation. And then, like I said, identifying an exposure limit, that's really the most important thing. If you've got a compound that you're looking for, you want to know whether your employees are being exposed above that exposure limit, and you'll want to be able to talk to the lab about accurately identifying what that exposure is. So when you do reach out to the lab, you'll want to provide some information as well once you've got a good idea of what it is that you want to test for. Things to consider, we've all seen a triangle like this before, I'm sure. There's a balance between things like turnaround time, cost, and quality. Alex mentioned some baseline things you want to look for in terms of quality, like accreditation, ISO, standard practices. You know, there are labs out there who can provide analyses that, you know, may be a bit cheaper and may not have the same quality standards as you'd find with other labs. That's just something to consider when you're setting up your sampling plan. Turnaround time and cost go hand in hand, so that's something that you want to communicate with your laboratory as well on the outset to make sure that all of those expectations are set ahead of time and you can plan accordingly. So some of the analytical parameters that we look at as a lab, we work in reporting limits, and then our customers, our clients, work in exposure limits. And so there's having a conversation with your laboratory about what they can support in terms of analytical reporting limits and whether or not that can meet your exposure limits from an analytical standpoint is very important. We'll get into more detail on that a little bit later. But then also communicating the target compounds that you're looking at. CAS numbers are really the best way to do that. Especially if you're looking at like an SDS sheet, there can be a lot of chemical synonyms out there. It may not necessarily be clear what compound you're looking for, but a CAS number is a really good baseline way to communicate that. And so then you'll want to discuss your sampling approach with your lab. Sometimes a lab has a specific set of methods. They may support one and not another for a given compound. So you want to confirm that the lab you're using will be able to support a method that works for you. You'll also want to discuss the appropriate sampling media with that lab. A lot of labs do provide sampling media to their clients, so you'll want to see what's available and whether or not that'll work. A lot of times there's an option for like a passive sampling option with a passive badge, which has some advantages over active sampling with a sampling pump. So that's something you can discuss with your lab. We'll talk a little bit more about passive badges later on as well. And then just, you know, discussing the sampling duration and flow rate and overall sample volume. That's also really important in ensuring that you collect a sample that we can analyze properly. So we'll go through a quick example here. In this case, we're looking at benzene. So let's say you want to evaluate benzene in your workplace over an 8-hour period. You would look up this OSHA PEL, and you would see that the PEL TWA is 1 ppm. So we're just going to assume a passive badge is the preferred sampling option in this example. So the first question you want to ask the lab is, can the method you support detect benzene at 1 ppm? The next question you want to ask is, how long do I need to collect my sample for in order to ensure a reporting limit is below this 1 ppm PEL? So what your lab should hopefully be able to tell you is, first, what their RL is going to be. In this case, it's 0.001 milligrams per sample. They should be able to relate that to the published uptake rate for that compound on whatever passive sampler you want to use, and then determine, based on the lab's reporting limits, a minimum sample time of 20 minutes would be required in order to report a 1 ppm value at their reporting limit. So in this case, if you're able to see the sampling parameter there on this cutout from an analytical report, it says the exposure was 455 minutes, which is well above that 20-minute minimum. And so the result that's reported is less than the detection limit, but that'll give you a result that's less than 0.043 ppm. And that's well below the 1 ppm that we were evaluating. Stells also have a higher exposure limit, so that minimum sampling time can change. So now I'm going to go through some basic sampling setup and practices for sampling. So when you're doing your sampling approach, the first thing you'll want to do is review the reference method, like I mentioned earlier. You can review some sampling parameters ahead of time so you know that you're going to collect that sample correctly. And then you'll also want to check for specific shipping and storage stability requirements that have been validated for that method. So an example we have here is for formaldehyde. This is taken from the NIOSH 2016 method. And if you've ever looked at one of these NIOSH methods, there's a really nice summary on the very first page. And you can get a lot of good information there. In this case, you know, when you're planning your sampling event, you'll want to look at the recommended flow rate, and then you'll want to look at the minimum and maximum sample volume. That'll help you determine your sampling time as well. There are limitations to certain media. You know, if the method states, you know, you can only sample up to 120 minutes, but you want to sample for 8 hours, that's something that you'll want to discuss with the lab and review the method on before you go out and collect your samples. Outside of that, that nice summary, there's also sections that outline sampling, you know, sampling steps from A to Z in a more detailed manner. It's always important to review these as well. One thing I want to point out specifically from this formaldehyde method is it calls out the need to wrap your samples in aluminum foil to protect it from direct sunlight. If anyone has questions on this, I can go into more detail as to why that is. But essentially, you want to make sure that you're following all the protocols to ensure that the lab can deliver an accurate result once we receive your sample. So that's something you can consult with the lab on. Chances are it's a question that's been asked and answered before. So again, always highly recommend reading through the method before going out and collecting your samples. And so now I'm going to hand it back over to Alex, and he's going to discuss passive sampling and go through a few other media types.
Great, thanks. So now you've gotten to the point. So we've talked with the lab, we've done the preparation. We're going to talk a little bit more about cassettes, what those different cassettes are, and then we'll actually go into the actual sampling portion. So we have a couple different things that we're going to talk about. So we have active versus passive sampling. Where you're active is where you actually have a pump that's actively pulling air through a filter, and you can see something, it would look something similar to this, right? Where there is a pump, and I'll show you a picture later on of what the pumps look like, but it's pulling air, it's going through a filter. Any of the particulates or the compound of interest is being collected on that filter that gets sent to the lab to be analyzed. These are really nice because you have very precise control of flow rates and volumes. So you'll be able to be like, okay, yeah, I want to run this at 2 liters per minute for 480 minutes, right? Then you know exactly what your total volume will be. And what I wanted to just drill home one more time about volumes, because it is super important. There is a correlation between how much or how many liters you actually, or how much your volume is compared to how low your reporting limit can go. Typically, the higher the volume you get, the lower your reporting limit will be able to go. So we also do recommend this for short-term samples. So if you're taking a Stell, we will always recommend an active sampling over a passive, just because you're going to be able to get more volume out of the active sampling than you will a passive where it's more diffusive, right? With a diffusion-based collection. So that, and therefore your reporting limit is more than often it's going to be lower with the active versus the passive. And then you also had, and in regards to that, you will also have a higher sensitivity for many compounds because of that higher volume that you're taking in. Passive samplers, these are really good, and A lot of IHs prefer this if they're doing an 8-hour exposure and can use these just because they're a lot less intrusive to the employee, right? Like for someone to have to go around and wear this pump all day, this heavy pump that's a pound or two, and wrap this around and have all these different tubings and things hooked to them, these are a lot less invasive, where you can just, you know, unpack it, clip it on. You don't have to worry about making sure your calibrations are correct. They're just a lot simpler from beginning to end. So if you're doing some longer sampling times and you've talked with the lab and made sure that your reporting limits are going to be low enough, then these are great options for that. Like I said, these are just diffusion-based sampling, so no pumps required. Couple air sampling basics. So you have a cassette. Here's what your cassette looks like. Couple things with cassettes. Things that we have seen is people sampling or connecting the pump to the wrong end of the cassette. The way I always remember this is typically you're going to have a red and a blue side. Red, or the blue, goes towards the blue sky, so that one goes towards the open environment, where the red side is typically what you're going to want to connect to the pump. You are also going to have a wagon wheel, is what I refer to that as on the bottom, that also would connect to the pump, so you can look for that. So there's a couple different cues for you to be able to ensure that you're sampling in the correct direction. And the reason for that is you want to make sure that when it enters the filter that it spaces out correctly, that the particles do, so it'll take up the whole filter versus just taking a very small portion where, you know, you could start worrying about maybe breakthrough or just be collected in one portion. You're not going to get a full sample if it is collected on the wrong end. So the lab will typically, if they can see it, they'll let you know that it was sampled incorrectly as well. All right, so next we have sorbent tubes here. So these are sorbent tubes. A couple of things with these that you'll need to look at as well. Make sure you are sampling in the correct direction. You're always going to see a little arrow on those. So check out for that little arrow. That is the direction of the airflow that it needs to go towards the pump. So if you have a pump, you're going to need to connect the pump to this end over here. Some labs will send out tube breakers for you, some don't. So I've seen people break the ends of those with whether it be pliers or keys. But those are some different things that you can use. Just make sure that you do it safely. Another thing with this is there are two protectors that you can put on the end. If your lab doesn't supply that either, that's just fine. Typically what I would do is just cut off a little bit of tubing, stick it on the end there so that the employee, there's no potential to be able to get cut by the ends there. So just put a little bit of tubing on there. But these are great. These are for a lot of different chemicals that you're gonna be using these for that. Same thing with the Carbotrap tube, but they use thermal desorption versus chemical desorption, and these are for something like a TO17. They're great for lower reporting limits too. So just another type of media that you can see there. All right, next we have whole air sampling, which you're going to see something like a SUMA canister. So that's this big space-looking canister here. And the nice thing with these is you can collect up to 24 hours with these. So if you need to do an indoor air quality sample and you want to do it for a full 24 hours, you can. Or if you want to do 8 hours, whatever it is you might want to do, you can do it. They call it whole air sampling because it is actually collecting the air and not any particulates per se. It'll actually collect the air that you have in your environment, gets stored in this canister. You'll send that to the lab, and then we actually will analyze the air that you send back. These will have very low reporting limits too. And so one thing to note with these is this is for indoor air quality. We do get a lot of cans back that are, there's a lot more in them than what should be, and it can ruin our instruments, so we have to dilute it a lot. So just because all of a sudden we're getting stuff in parts per million instead of parts per billion. And so there's a lot of dilution that has to go on. And like I said, so always make sure that you are using this for this indoor air quality. There are some other really cool instruments out there as well. This one's called an HCS sampler. So this is basically like a canister, but you can use these for personal sampling actually. So you could stick this in the pocket of someone there, and which makes it super nice. So makes that really nice to be able to use. It kind of does the same thing. The technology is a little different.
Where are you off to?
And so anyway, yeah, that makes it nice for that.
Then you bus left to go to a town called.
It sounds like we have some interference going on there, Hunter. Can you mute other people in the meeting?
In 5 years.
Yeah, I'm
Okay,
not
thank
sure
you.
who it's coming from, but we'll get them muted. Everybody please stay muted.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Go ahead, Alex.
Yep. As far as, and then we're moving on to wipe sampling basics here. So there's a couple things that you're going to need for wipes. The first thing being the media. So you got your gauze, your wipe, and your filter. So this is what those look like. It'll typically be a ghost wipe or your gauze here, but this is what you're going to actually use to wipe the surface. Then you'll have a wetting agent. So this could be something like IPA, methanol, DI water, just depending on whatever it is that you're sampling for. That will, and this is something that you're going to want to talk with the lab with, because you need to be specific with these. There will be some wetting agents that will work with some compounds where others don't work with others. So always make sure you're in communication with the lab as far as what the wetting agent needs to be for that. Next, you have the wipe template. So a lot of times labs will send you out with a 100 centimeter squared template or something similar, so that you can make sure you know what size of area that you are wiping for. And then lastly, just a container to put that into, whether it be some type of centrifuge tubes, something similar to that, and then you'll send that back to the lab. Sometimes they will require you to put it in some type of solution as well to make sure that the sample stays stable. So once again, talk with the lab as far as that's concerned. All right, so as far as proper use of sampling media, we'll start with calibration. I have a couple different setups here, but basically you want to set up the pump, going to the filter, then going to whatever calibrator you have there. I have seen some people just hook the pump straight up to your calibration unit, and that is not correct. You always need to make sure that you have your filter in there so that you can account for the pressure that is actually being pulled from the filter into your pump. Because let's say you're running at 2 liters per minute. If you just run that straight to your calibration unit and you get it to 2 liters per minute, great. But once you plug in your filter, all of a sudden you're running at 1.7 liters per minute instead of 2. So that can mess up the amount of volume you're actually taking in. When to use primary calibrators versus secondary. So you have primary calibrators, and a primary calibrator there's very high traceability to these. To national standards like NIST to make sure it has very high accuracy, and it's considered the gold standard. And then what you do is there's something called secondary calibrators. I guess your primary calibrator would be something like a Defender. There are also the Checkmates that I've seen that do a good job. So there's a lot of different primary calibrators out there that you can use. Then you have your secondary ones, which are something like your rotometers, which are compared against a primary standard and can be used in the field, but a lot of times you want to make sure that that has been checked against a primary calibrator first. So the reason you do a calibration in the field as well is just because it changes in elevation, humidity, and other factors. So even if a lab has calibrated your pumps and everything beforehand, you're always going to want to check it when you're out in the field, just because, you can have a lab that's 3,000 feet up and it gets shipped to sea level, and that's going to change your flow rate. So, or vice versa. So always make sure that you're doing your pre-calibrations, and then also that you do a post-calibration once everything is done. One other thing to note that I've seen is there are clients who do not ask for a calibration filter, and you're always going to want to ask for an extra filter for calibration, and we're going to talk about blanks as well. And so you don't want to use a filter that you are using in the field or as a sample as a calibration filter. You're always going to want to bring in an extra one to be able to do that. If you're doing a lot of samples, then just hold on to that one for later. You don't have to throw that one away. Even if it expires, you can always still use that calibration filter. Just make sure you label it, and then you can feel free to use that all the time for your calibrations. But just make sure you're not using whatever filter you're going to be using in the field as that. That's another thing that I've seen. And then one last thing here is make sure you check your calibration date. So these primary calibrators actually always need to be sent in once a year, is typically what they are, for its own calibration. So make sure that your calibrators are always within those dates, and if they need to be recalibrated, make sure you send those in to be recalibrated before using them again. And there we go. I already talked about the additional media for calibration. All right, so basic sampling guide. So couple pointers as far as sampling goes, and this is really important. And always, and this is from my experience as well, if you ask the individual beforehand to do the sampling, it usually goes a lot smoother for a couple of reasons. One, make sure that they're wearing a belt or that they're wearing tighter pants. I've put it on people before where they're wearing super loose pants, and then you throw another pump on there, a pump or two, and then yeah, their pants are falling down all day. It kind of becomes a mess. So that's one thing to look for. I've had people actually not wear pumps because they don't feel comfortable doing it. They don't know what it's for. So if you can, always make sure to ask them beforehand, explain to them the reasoning behind it is what you're doing. We talked about placing the pump on the pants or the belt, and so that's a good demonstration of what that would look like. And then you're going to wrap the tubing around the backside, typically is what I've seen to be the most effective. You're going to want to put it in a way that doesn't disturb the employee or whoever, the person you're putting the sample on, too much. So something like this setup will typically work. And then you're going to wrap the tubing around the back and clip the filter within the breathing zone. So here's a good example of a setup with a cassette holder and then also a cyclone. So you can see how that will wrap around and then it's clipped within the breathing zone there to be collected. And this is typically how any of that sampling will go. You want that sample to be within that breathing zone. Another just a quick tip, check on those pumps every hour or so or less. I've been to one too many sampling events where a pump goes out, whether one of your tubing got kinked and the pump shuts off, or battery runs out, or whatever else it might be. Always check on it. The worst thing you can do is start it at the beginning of the day and then come back at the end of the day and the pump shut off. And then you don't get a sample for that day because you have no idea when that pump shut off. At least if you could, check it every so often, that way you can kind of eliminate some of that and you can kind of pinpoint when that pump had shut off. Sometimes I have seen, especially with PPI samplers, that the tubing is brought in front, or if they were a smock or different things. And so you just want to make sure it's not getting in the way of the employee. But whatever configuration you have there, just make sure that you're not kinking any of the tubing there. All right, next thing here is fill blanks. We do get a lot of questions about fill blanks on why and what those are used for. So the purpose of the fill blank is you want to identify contamination from media preparation, transport, and handling. And so that's why we have that. We just want to make sure that that sample was not contaminated along the way. And it'll help distinguish between workplace contaminants and sampling artifacts too. That way we can, if you do have something on your blank, we can work with it to make sure that your other samples are not compromised, and that we can even take out whatever amount was on those blanks from your regular samples. But it's really important that you do have those blanks there. As far as what you do with the blanks, all you got to do is open them up and close them again in a clean environment. So super simple, just open those up, close them. A lot of times what I'll do is, if it's a cassette, I'll switch around the little plugs there, and that to me demonstrates, okay, the red one is now on the top and then the blue one is on the bottom there, just to signify that it's a blank, and always make sure you label it as a blank too. And then we always get a lot of questions about how many blanks should I be sending in, and we refer back to the method. The OSHA technical manual states that you just need one fill blank per requested analysis, but really that can depend on how many samples you send in to, right? So that's up to the industrial hygienist to be able to determine how many blanks need to be sent in. For a more sensitive analysis, we always recommend considering additional blanks to send in, and it just helps with the validity of your sampling event there. All right, so, and then now we are moving on to submitting samples to the lab. So you've gone through, you've done all your sampling, you have your blanks, now you're going to be sending it to the lab, and I'm going to turn it back over to Bevan.
Thanks, Alex. Yeah, so again, getting back to media selection, you know, you've collected your samples, and you want to make sure that the samples are getting submitted to the lab in a manner that is conducive to how those media types should be handled. And turnaround time, again, you'll want to make sure that's communicated with the lab ahead of time. Usually a day or two notice is great. If you do need to submit samples for rush analysis, definitely make sure that's communicated to the lab to ensure that they've got the resources in place to handle that. Standard turnaround time for most labs is 5 to 10 business days for most analyses, at least in the industrial hygiene realm. Rush analysis is typically offered, that can be 24 to 72 hours. Some labs do same day analysis. That definitely requires prior notice. And again, you know, you'll want to discuss pricing with your lab as it pertains to turnaround times and rush turnaround rates. And then the last thing you'll want to consider is proper documentation. We'll want to receive your labs or your samples correctly at the lab, but we also need a way to match those physical samples to all of the information we're going to be putting into our systems to generate a report. The way that's done is a chain of custody form or an analytical request form. So you want to make sure you get a copy of this form from the lab in advance so that you can fill it out, make sure all the information that the lab needs is there before you go to ship out your samples. The major highlights are turnaround time, contact information so we know who to send the report to, if there's an alternative billing address or an AP department that receives invoices. Make sure you include that on the chain of custody form as well. And then the most important couple of things are just providing a sample ID on your chain of custody form that we can match to a physical sample. A lot of times we'll see a serial number that's printed on a sorbent tube or a cassette used as a sample ID. That works great. We have a sample receiving group who can easily match what's on your chain of custody form to that serial number. You'll also want to include your sample volume or sample area if it's a surface wipe sample. And that'll allow us to report results in volume-based units like micrograms per meter cubed or ppm. If we don't have that information, all we can report is a micrograms per sample value, which you won't be able to relate to an exposure limit directly. And then finally, indicating the method and target compounds that you'll need for each individual sample. This is especially important if you're sampling for multiple compounds using multiple methods, multiple media types. It needs to be really clear which samples need which analysis. And so this is the place to do that. Aside from that, it's a standard chain of custody form, signatures, you know, time of relinquished, and then time when they're received here in our sample receiving group. We'll also include comments on anything unusual that we see with your submission. You'll also want to consider shipping requirements. We kind of touched on this a little bit earlier. Going back to our formaldehyde sample or method, NIOSH 2016, this will indicate what sort of requirements are needed for this given media type. You'll want to make sure it's shipped on ice if that's what the method calls for, and then you'll also get information on sample hold times. This is something the lab should be familiar with. So if you want to coordinate, you know, a project where you're collecting samples over the course of multiple days, whether or not all of those samples can be shipped together at the end of your sampling event and remain within the method's hold times, or if they need to be shipped overnight, immediately after sampling. So just make sure that you're checking those either prior to sampling or once you're ready to submit those to the lab, and then ensure that the lab can meet method established hold times within the requested turnaround time. Additionally, it's always a good idea to ask the lab if they can provide additional equipment like coolers and ice packs. This can be convenient, especially on a quick turn project if it's an emergency, something like that. Typically, a lab can send out these sort of items with the media to your location so that all you have to do is collect your sample, throw them back in a cooler, and ship them back to the lab. So once you've submitted your samples to the lab, we'll do the analysis and then we'll generate a report. And so I'm going to walk through a few things to look out for when you're actually interpreting the results on that report. So here's an example for silica, and you'll see there's a handful of values included on that report. So the first one is the lab's reporting limit, and that's listed there on the right. And you'll note the units are in micrograms per sample. That's because it's just a baseline value that we can see from any given sample without factoring in, all the different variable sample volumes that we could get from project to project. Once we factor in the air volume to the actual analytical result, you can see that we would report a value in micrograms per meter cubed, in this case for quartz, cristobalite, and tritomite, and then total silica as well. So this is what you will want to compare directly to your exposure limit, whether it's in micrograms per meter cubed or ppm. This kind of gives you the whole picture as far as what the lab can see and what you can use as far as reporting an actual positive result. Once you've got this data, a lot of times, if it's an 8-hour sample, it's easy, but if you've collected something for like a 10-hour shift or a 12-hour shift, you'll need to calculate your TWA. That's not something a lot of labs provide in their analytical reports. I believe some do, but that's not something that we do at our lab. So that's something that you'll need to calculate using your report, and we can definitely, Alex is a CIH, he can assist you with that sort of thing if you need guidance, or just any CIH. It's a pretty standard practice. Stels are by definition a 15-minute sample, so that's something you can also factor in when you're looking at an analytical report like this. And then one thing I want to mention is just sealing limits. So these require a direct read instrument. You're not going to actually get an analytical report for a sealing limit analysis because these evaluations should be done on site and shouldn't require the collection of a sample and submission to a lab. Typically, the window is pretty short on when you get that result and when you take an action on that result. So in addition to an analytical report, most labs will send you a QC report as well. Oftentimes that depends on what sort of level report you get. If it's a level 1, level 2, 3, and 4. A level 2 and up will include an additional PDF that's separate with lab QCs. This can be useful in just troubleshooting a result that may or may not make sense. You can kind of evaluate the analysis within the scope of just the lab's performance. So this will include a lab method blank, a lab control sample, and then a duplicate of that control sample. The method blank is something we add in here at the lab. It's independent of the samples that you collected on site, but it's run at the same time. It's run through all the same processes. So what you would want to see is a non-detect or an ND to show that there was no lab-introduced contamination to the analysis. Similarly with the control sample, it's the same principle, but we've actually spiked in the target compound. And so we can measure recovery and confirm that an accurate result was reported. The duplicate is just a little bit of extra information, which shows that we can hit that accurate result and we can do it reliably through the course of an analytical run. So this is useful because it can sometimes answer some questions you might have about, if there's some unknown reason why you're getting a positive result. This can at least help you eliminate or identify an issue with the lab. So we've covered a lot of what you'll want to do as far as planning a sampling event and coordinating with the lab, what to do with the results once you've got it. We're just going to go through with our remaining time a few common pitfalls that you can run into. Alex will go over some of the new regulations. We're running a little short on time if we want to have time for questions, so we'll try to get through this quickly. I apologize for the fast pace, but let's go ahead and talk about some of the pitfalls you can run into with sorbent tubes. So this is a picture of a typical sorbent tube. You'll notice there's two sections of sorbent in each tube. One is the primary section and the other is the backup section. You'll notice the backup section is a little bit smaller. The reason for this is to avoid something called breakthrough. This typically happens either when the flow rate is too high or your sampling duration is too long. What happens is your target compound runs into that primary sorbent section, and over the course of time, if there's too much air passing through that sorbent tube, it'll actually push that target compound into the backup layer. And in extreme cases, it'll push it right out the back of the sorbent tube. This is problematic because it produces bias low results and really doesn't give you very good data. So one thing that we do as a lab to try to help provide some more information to you in these situations is we actually analyze the front and back sections separately. And then we combine those results into a single reportable result that shows up on your analytical report. We will include a comment if we see that there's compound present in the backup layer. Sometimes it can help identify if it looks like all of your target compound is in the backup layer. That's a pretty good indication that the sorbent tube was just oriented backwards. And so you had everything, you had the inlet where the backup is when it should be in the reverse. Cassettes, it's really the same two issues that cause what's called overloading. So for things like silica and metals where you're sampling kind of dust in air, overloading can be an issue. And again, it can produce biased low results where the sample material starts to build up on top of the filter. We have loose material that can be difficult to process with what's entrained in the filter. And sometimes it can get stuck up inside the actual cassette itself. And that can be really difficult to process from an analytical perspective. Sometimes the lab can't recover all of that material if there's just too much of it caught up inside the cassette. And in some cases, in extreme cases, the excess sample mass can be beyond what the method can even accommodate. An example of this is for silica in NIOSH 7500. Again, if you read into the sampling criteria, you'll see this note here that says do not exceed 2 milligrams of dust loading on a filter. For anybody who's ever used an analytical scale, you'll know that 2 milligrams really isn't very much at all. And it can be really difficult to gauge, when you're just standing out in an open area, am I collecting 2 milligrams over the course of 8 hours? It's a really fine line to walk, but it's something to be aware of. So it's a really low threshold. A lot of labs can accommodate this by splitting the sample into multiple analyses, kind of like I mentioned we do with sorbent tubes, and then combining the result at the end. Although oftentimes this can be more resource and time intensive. Some labs will include an extra fee for doing this. So you want to definitely make sure that you're getting feedback from the lab and adjusting your sampling practices accordingly, either using a lower flow rate or maybe splitting up your 8-hour sample into 2 4-hour samples. At our lab, we can accommodate up to a 7 milligram sample before it, at least for silica, before it has to be processed as a bulk sample. And that's problematic because you end up losing information. And here's just kind of a quick example to show you what that looks like. We've got 9.6 milligrams on the left. You can see there's a little bit of sample material there, and then a couple of extreme cases where there's just either in a PPI sampler or a cassette, just a lot of extra sample material that can't be processed. So I'm going to hand the rest of the presentation over to Alex. He'll go through some other pitfalls and some regulatory information as well.
Yep, like Bevan said, I'm going to kind of go through this quickly, but with some of these pitfalls, this is how I imagine clients look like when they're calling me regarding some of these things. So let's see here. So first thing is tipping over cyclones. So we're going to talk just briefly about PPIs versus cyclones, and you can always watch Dusty Ott. He did a presentation with RAECO right before this one. Great presentation, so you can go check that one out too if you want a lot more information specifically on that. But with the tipping over cyclones, you can't flip them over. It's because of the grid pot, it actually will collect dust in there, and if you flip it over, it gets onto your filter and will ruin your sample there. So that's one thing to always be careful of. We've actually had some people who have sent in samples with the cyclone still attached to it, which you want to take those off and seal those up before sending them in. Otherwise, yeah, once again, it's going to be tipped over. Bevan already touched on proper storage and shipping. I won't go into that. Insufficient sampling time. So if you don't sample for enough time, this is why it's so important to talk with a lab. You might not get a reporting limit that is low enough for your goal of whatever, the PEL that you're trying to reach. If you don't sample for enough time, you might not reach that, and you're not going to have a sample that's going to be worth anything at that point. And then what to do with data. This is another really big one, just because you always want the end in mind before starting. So you always want to have something that you can compare the results to, or you need to temper the expectations of the client that you're working with and say, like, look, there aren't any exposure limits associated with this. We deal with this a lot of times with pesticides. With this specific pesticide, we are just going to look and see if it's there or if it's not. I've seen a lot of consultants get mixed up in this where they we find a sampling method for them, they run their sample, they get the results back, and then they call me and ask me, all right, so is this dangerous? And then I have to go back to them and tell them, sorry, like there's nothing to really compare it to, so I wouldn't be able to tell you one way or the other if this is dangerous or not. And then that's what they have to tell their client. So always make sure you have the end in mind with what you're going to be working with. Collecting multiple compounds on the same sampling media. So we deal a lot with this with passive badges, where you can do something like one of the bigger ones is BTEX, your benzene, toluene, ethylbenzene, and xylene. Those can be sampled together. You're going to be able to find a lot of other VOCs that can be sampled together, but sometimes it's not compatible. So always check with the lab to make sure that the ones you're looking at can all be sampled on the same media there. I'm going to go very briefly into these. So these are just so you're aware, these are some new EPA WCPPs that have come out, and just so you know, these are regulatory standards. So even if OSHA's is higher, you need to follow the EPA's regulations on this. We have seen this, especially we've seen a lot more samples come in regarding methylene chloride, and they're actually trying to phase this out in all industries. So just some different things to be aware of there. You can click on the link below there to get to that if you want. I'm not going to go into NIOSH versus OSHA, other than NIOSH is more recommended. They're typically more conservative, whereas OSHA would be the actual governing body that you could potentially get fines from, things like that. Evolving industry standards. So you have all your different types of cyclones here. We're running out of time. I'm not going to be able to talk too much about this. But one thing I did want to mention, some of the more confusing aspects of the MSHA silica ruling. So one thing is flow rates. One thing I've seen over and over again are the flow rates that show up in the MSHA regulation. They say 1.7 liters per minute. That is just for the Dore Oliver cyclone. That does not mean that every cyclone needs to have a 1.7 liters per minute. So that's one thing that I have seen people use 1.7 liters per minute for something like this aluminum cyclone, and you're going to mess up your sample doing that. They all have different flow rates. Same thing with PPI samplers. Like this one's at 2, they have 4 and 8 liters as well. Which cyclone to use? It just needs to conform with the ISO 7708 1995 standard. So just look at the manufacturer's guide for that. Typically, it's a PVC filter that you're going to be using for that. And then lastly, I wanted to go into this just briefly about which method to use, IR versus XRD, just because we have had some issues with coal mines as far as determining what they need to do. Here's what it says within the regulation itself that people are getting confused with. MSHA expects the samples collected in M&M mines will be analyzed by XRD, and samples collected in coal mines will be analyzed by FTIR. And expects is a very interesting word, right, to be used within a regulatory standard. I ended up finding this later on. This was another publication that came out from MSHA, and you can go to both of these citations here. But I thought they said this much more clearly, where XRD methods can be used to analyze either respirable coal mine dust or M&M respirable dust samples. So it could be used for, XRD can be used for either of those, where IR can only be used for the RCMD samples. So just a quick clarification there, because we have gotten a lot of questions regarding that. And this is one thing that you can use to, because XRD is much more available than this FTIR is for sure. As far as illicit drugs, so there's a new fentanyl and a new ACGIH-TWA for that. A lot of people are looking to do wipe samples for methamphetamine. We've seen a huge increase in that too. These are some other possible drugs that that are becoming more prevalent. As time goes on, we have seen an increase in all of these. So if you're looking to sample for more of these, there are more regulatory standards coming out for those too. In summary, we just wanted to make sure that you guys are aware of what the different things that you need before sampling. So we just wanted to go through the whole process with you and kind of go through some things that we see as a lab that would help us out and help you out as well. We really appreciate your time with this, and hope everyone here was able to learn something new. So thank you very much. And we'll turn the time back over to Hunter.
Alex and Bevan, great presentation. Thank you so much for enlightening us today with this presentation. We do have quite a few questions that have popped in. Unfortunately, there is only a 1-hour runtime on this, and so please, if you have questions, take down the contact information for Alex and Bevan both here. And I know for a fact that they would be more than happy to answer those questions for you guys. This webinar will be viewable via the training videos tab and webinar tab on our website, raecorents.com. And so people can go and view this, 24/7. It's free for people to go and view, and be able to, gather this information and follow along with the presentation. Just so everybody knows, RAECO Rents will be at many future conferences this summer and fall, including but not limited to ASSP Safety in Orlando, the Essential Minerals Association Fall Conference, and many local chapter AIHA conferences. Come visit our booths. We would love to speak with you further about new products in our fleet and how we can continue providing great rental services to you and your companies. We are always open to new topics for future webinars. If you have a subject you'd like to see covered, we would love to hear your feedback. Please fill out the post-webinar survey or send us an email. Thank you everyone for attending our webinar. If you have any questions that need to be answered, please reach out to Alex and Bevan, and they would be happy to assist. Thank you again, Alex and Bevan, and I hope everybody has a safe and happy rest of your day. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.